What's up? We're back with episode 2. Today we're going to talk about MiniDisc. It's going to be a 2-part episode. The first part, we're just going to go over what is MiniDisc, and then part 2 is going to be a separate video where we actually go in and repair a MiniDisc player. So what is a MiniDisc? Well, it's one of these. As you can see, it looks like it's a little CD-ROM inside of a mini CD-ROM inside of a little plastic caddy type of, almost like a old floppy disk or something. It's got an even door like a floppy disk, so that when you put it into the machine, door opens and the optical reader can read the music and or data off of the disc. It's a pretty handy, pretty compact little device that allows you to record, re-record, and you can skip tracks forward and backwards. It's also got some pretty advanced anti-skip technology. So it's a cool format, but it didn't quite make it. Before we talk about that, let's talk about why this even existed in the first place. So in order to really understand why Sony came out with the MiniDisc, when they already had a bunch of other formats on the market, not to mention other competing companies' formats, why do we need another format at the time in 1992 when this came out? Well, in order to understand that, you got to know what other formats were there and what was their place in the market and why did they exist. So you got to go way back. This was the cassette tape, or compact cassette as it's technically known. This was developed by Philips. This entered the market in 1963. Obviously it takes a while to be fully adopted, but I would call this kind of the gold standard in consumer audio in the 80s. Like, this is what kids were buying their music on. We all know that one. In 1982, Philips and Sony developed the compact disc, which we all know. And then in 1987, Sony created the DAT, or digital audio tape. So that was out in 1987. And then 1992, we've got the MiniDisc. Another one to note that Philips created. So we've got Philips, Sony, well, actually Sony and Philips, Sony, and then Sony again, and then Philips, not to be outdone, they also, in 1992, the same year that the MiniDisc came out, they introduced something called the digital compact cassette, which was a lot more like the DAT, but it was meant to be a direct competitor to the MiniDisc. So I'll get into that a little bit later. Next, I want to show you a chart that I made, and it's a quick competitive analysis of these different formats. So quick things to note about this chart. This is a comparison of what I would consider the 4 major formats available in the early 90s. I'm going to ignore DCC because that didn't really take off, and then DAT was relegated more to professional use because it had high quality audio, but it was just too expensive, so it was more of a pro recording studio kind of a format. So if in the early 90s, if you were an average consumer, you had the compact disc, which was relatively new, or you were hanging on to the cassette tape. Why would you hang on to the cassette tape? Well, probably because A, you're already invested in it, you had a big collection of cassette tapes, you already had cassette players in your car, you had a Walkman, you've got a boombox, you got all of these things that can play cassette tapes. Why would you need to move on? Not to mention, if you like making your own recordings, like you want to make mixtapes, or you want to record songs off the radio, or do any of that kind of thing, cassette tape was really the only way to do it. So in the early 90s, the MiniDisc on paper looked like a great alternative because it gave you all of the things you were missing from compact disc. It gave you recordability, and it gave you anti-skip. So it was actually a lot more portable. It's a very small form factor, so you could take it with you. You didn't have to worry about skipping. It had a lot better sound quality than the cassette tape. Arguably, not arguably, it wasn't quite as good as compact disc because there was a compression algorithm there, but the average user, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between compact disc and mini disc. So you had compact disc equivalent audio and all those features. It looked like a good option, so I can see why Sony developed this and why they marketed it in the early 90s. So what happened? Well, fortunately not much. It turns out that when Sony released the MiniDisc, it was priced way too high. In this article I found from The Guardian, it mentions that when it launched the MiniDisc in September of 1992, Sony seemed to not have noticed that its target market, teenagers, couldn't afford what it was selling. The MZ1 MiniDisc player recorder cost $750, which didn't lure teenagers away from cassettes and CDs. Yeah, I don't know anybody who could have afforded a $750 portable media player in 1992. That's just outrageously priced. And that's just one example. Obviously, there were a lot of different mini disc players. Sony did not skimp on that. They pumped out a lot of different mini disc players, including car stereos, boom boxes, home versions that go on your stereo stack. There were professional versions that were rack mounted. There was a lot of different types of mini disc players. So there's no shortage of devices to play the mini disc on. It just didn't get wide adoption, mainly because it was just too expensive for the average user to afford. It was, I think, a little bit cheaper in places like Japan and Europe and the UK, and so it got more adoption there. You could buy actual albums on the format, which was cool, but I don't think I know I saw a reference in the UK saying that at HMV, which was their version of Tower Records or what have you at the time, there was just a little mini disc rack of albums in the back. So it wasn't a huge thing in Europe, but it was something you could find and get if you wanted to. So it had some success in Europe, and I think Japan was most successful there, and I would imagine it was cheaper to get there because there were no import duties or any of the other stuff that you would have to worry about when getting one of these devices over to a US or European market. So that would be my assumption of why it was most successful in Japan, was probably because it was more affordable. So even though Sony didn't have much of a market presence in the US, that wasn't for lack of trying. The very first mini disc portable player had some product placement in the Arnold Schwarzenegger Last Action Hero movie. It was featured in various other movies. There's a movie called Strange Days, which was released in '95, but takes place, I guess, in the last days of 1999 as it was going into New Year's of the year 2000. That features some version of the mini disc as a big part of the plot point. I've never seen the movie. I remember seeing the trailer for it back in the day and thinking that it was a terrifying looking dystopia. I've read the plot synopsis. Apparently it's about some sort of a cyber rig you can hook up to your head that allows you to relive people's memories and feelings as if you're living it yourself, and all these things are recorded onto a data disc, which is the mini disc. Obviously mini disc can't really do that, so it was a work of fiction, and I guess in the movie there's the plot point of a black rapper is murdered by police, and then there's protests on police brutality, and the police respond by with military force and tanks and riot vehicles and riot cops, and start harassing everyone, and it turns into this crazy scene. Obviously a dystopia. It's a good thing in 2020 that it's not a possibility. Other movie appearances were in 1999. The Matrix, if you notice the scene where Neo is selling some apparently illicit programs or something, he goes into a drawer and pulls out a mini disc. So those are some notable appearances in pop culture. So Sony was definitely trying to get their stuff into movies. I assume they did this purposely. Maybe some of it was just happenstance. I know that Arnold Schwarzenegger one was definitely on purpose, because I believe that movie studio was a Sony owned movie studio, so that would make sense that they would do that. That said, Sony did a market research study in 1997, and it found something like 70 to 75% of Americans had never even heard of MiniDisc at that point. So Sony realized they needed to do something to raise awareness and try to market this product in the US. So they did some grand marketing scheme and declared 1998 the year of the mini disc, or something along those lines. It didn't really work, and if you look at what was going on in 98, that's when you could get, recordable CDs were a thing, and they weren't as expensive as they once were, so you could make your own burn CDs. Memory was being built into Walkman, so I've got this one. This is my original one. This came out in 94, it says. Manufactured in 1994 December. This one skips like mad. It was garbage for having in the car, so I bought this one. This was built in September of 1998. This has a 40-second anti-shock memory built into it, so this was great. So in 98, there was less and less reason to have a mini disc and to spend that money, even though Sony was doing their best to try to convince people, and they were lowering prices of the players. I think they started to introduce some that were around $250 range, something like that. And then obviously we also had Napster was about to come out. I think that came out around 99 or 2000, and MP3s took over 2001, the introduction of the iPod. So at that point, everybody was going over to digital media or adapting the CD to various uses for making mixes and things like that. So it was really, really hard for MiniDisc to try to get a foothold. At that point, it was just kind of a downward spiral until 2013, where Sony finally threw in the towel. They announced a couple years beforehand that they'd be only producing one last MiniDisc model, and then the last of those models shipped by 2013. So that was it for the MiniDisc. So one of the interesting things I came across while researching this video is something called MiniDisc Day. So if you were wondering what's going on with MiniDisc today in 2020, well, there's this thing called MiniDisc Day where new artists are releasing new music on the format. So surprisingly enough, you can go to minidiscday.com and you can see all these artists. These seem to be very niche sort of genres. Most of the ones that I found on this list are synthwave or vaporwave type artists. There's some pretty cool stuff here actually that I'd never heard of before, that I found via this website. So if you have time, check it out. Again, a lot of these are vaporwave-esque type bands. And funny thing that I also noticed was that, in addition to mini discs, they've got compact discs and vinyl and cassette tapes and things like that. But almost all of these artists that I clicked through and looked at their merch, the mini disc version was already out of stock. So I don't know how many they made of these, but the mini disc Almost all of them are already sold. Looks like this one is still available here, but for the most part, most of these seem to be selling pretty well. Again, don't know how many they're actually printing, but they seem to be selling through a lot of them. So that's a pretty cool thing that's happening. It's great to see that there's still a fan base and still a market for an old format like this. So that's our look at MiniDisc. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. Tune in next time. We're going to do part 2 of the MiniDisc series, and in part 2 we're going to take apart and repair a MiniDisc player.
All right, you know what? This was dumb. Dump it. Trash it. This was garbage.